the Abscondo Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Abscondo Podcast. This is Mark. You know, my dad, for many years, has talked a lot about the second coming of Jesus Christ, the rapture, end times. And I guess I never really took any of that too seriously. I thought it was a kind of a silly thing to do, to wait for Jesus to somehow come down from the sky and save us, and all the sinners are supposed to go to hell, and all the believers are supposed to go to heaven. And I just didn't really take the story too seriously. And when I became spiritually awakened a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I came to understand the true meaning of that story. And I think it's important to understand that every spiritual teaching of any kind, from any religion, any tradition, is about teaching something, teaching a lesson, teaching some bit of wisdom. And that's the purpose of any kind of story. And I think the meaning behind the story of the rapture, and if you've somehow not heard this, if your parents aren't like mine, and you didn't come in from a conservative small town like I did in the USA, a lot of American Christians or fundamentalists believe that, as I said, that the devil's going to rule the world for a long time. There's a false prophet, Satan, and this entity will have complete grip on the world. It will rule everything, and people are going to be misled. And then Jesus will arrive. The second coming of Jesus Christ arrives into the world, and those who have faith in Jesus and Christ are saved and brought up to heaven, whereas all the people who have not made that conversion or have not declared Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior are supposed to be, die or be sent to hell or whatever it may be. And that's the basic idea behind the story of the rapture of end times. And when I spiritually awakened, I came to understand that the devil is a metaphor. The beast, Satan, it's a metaphor for something. It means something. It's not a dude with horns, as I said in the previous podcast. I firmly believe that the meaning of the devil is ego. I call it ego. A lot of people like me call it ego. And, Christians even say, like, you're possessed, you're mad, you're possessed. Yeah, that's the devil. That's ego. It's kind of clear if you think about it. And of course, people don't know what ego means. And I will get into that, and I will never stop talking about that. And we're going to have to learn what ego means, because that's what's going to be happening in this world right now. It's a massive letting go of ego. In fact, it's the death of ego. Okay? And this is where it gets really, really, really interesting. And I can't even believe this is true. I can't even believe we're living in end times. And I'll get into what end times means also. I think the undeniable truth in this situation in 2020, this collapse, this whatever you want to call it, I'll call it the massive awakening, I'll call it a lot of different things, and I'm sure we'll have a name for it someday. But what it is a death of ego. And ego has been dominating this world for thousands of years. It's been growing and growing and growing. This false prophet, right? The false prophet, the false Messiah is our own ego. And if you just look at the fact, and I know this to be true, and I know this is not conventional wisdom, we will learn this, we all will learn this in this present moment where all this stuff is happening. We are going to learn that the reason for any kind of disease or illness is ego. There may be some exceptions, birth defects, things like that, but the vast majority, the reason for illness and disease is ego. And the way that works is that ego is all about fear, it's all about stress, It's all about anxiety. And when your mind goes there, you're diverting the natural functioning of your immune system. Your body is being used up by this overactive, out of control mind. And that weakens your immune system. So you end up getting sick. Now, when a person spiritually awakens, and I'll get into what that means again, but basically it has to do with transcending the ego, killing the ego and living from a place from beyond ego. And when you do that, you really don't get sick anymore. So this virus is directly attacking the people with the biggest ego problems, people who are living in the egoic state in a very advanced way. These are the people who already have pre-existing conditions. These are the people who are unable to fight this virus, and these are the people who are already dying from this virus. Some of the people that are dying are pretty advanced egos. And it's not a criticism. It's just an observation of human behavior and what these concepts mean. And we're going to learn about this very slowly. So the other thing that's happening with the virus is that even those who are not going to catch it and not going to die from it, we have to learn to live without our egos. So we have a situation where you're holding on to certain identity through your possessions, through your beautiful homes and cars and fashion, and all these Instagram models looking so fabulous all the time, starting to decline pretty rapidly because it just doesn't seem appropriate anymore. When you're walking around with a face mask, when you're worried about your life, when you're worried about your job, when you're losing your job instantly, when you're losing everything that you were clinging to in the external world, there is no room for ego anymore. You're humbled. So now people who choose to continue the values of ego are not going to do very well. They're going to suffer. There's going to be suicides because people are suffering so much and so hopeless. People are waiting for things to go back to normal, but they're not going back to normal. And it pains me to say this. I'm not excited about this, even though this is what I've been preparing for, and this is how I've been living already for many, many years. And, in those times, nobody wanted to hear about this stuff because it just seemed like the world was a certain way, and what I was saying didn't make any sense, was irrelevant to the world. And, and sometimes that was difficult for me back then as well, to be a person who's writing about and talking about and living in a way that the world just didn't see the purpose for. The world had things figured out, didn't really want to hear any other ideas. And now, just within this normal functioning of the world, suddenly this kind of bad flu comes along, and the media sort of just goes nuts with it. And you have this worldometer tracking this one thing. They're not tracking all the other causes of death in every country and how many people die every day. They're tracking this one thing, and people are zoned in on this one number, as though that's all that matters in the world. The economy doesn't matter. The banks don't matter. Your basic personal freedom doesn't matter. Being able to cross a border between two countries doesn't matter anymore. There's no liberty. We live in a totalitarian state, and that became a reasonable option to a lot of people who are arguing that we're doing the right thing. But what's really happening is it just the ego went insane completely. It's been insane for a long time. The ego is insanity. I need to start defining ego. I'm using it a lot here. I realize that. But I want to lay out what's happening first. And this is happening in the present moment. I'm not saying what's going to happen or what has happened. This is what's happening. And it's going to continue to be happening in this ongoing, eternal, present moment, until the ego completely dies. And the longer it takes for it to die, the more suffering and pain we're going through. And it's going to take a while still. But I want the millions of us who get this message to help others through this, because there is no way back to that other way of life. You're going to do just fine as long as you're able to align with the Christ self within. And I don't mean everybody's got to become a Christian. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that Jesus, the message of Jesus meant something. He was saying these things for some purpose. And what he was trying to say, first of all, he talked a lot about love, and love is the antidote to fear. Now, the ego's basic emotion, the only emotion of ego, is fear. From fear flows a lot of other things like jealousy and anger and resentment and all that misery, those negative feelings. That's the ego. The ego, so the ego is this cause of suffering. But Jesus came along and he said, no, God is love. And, love comes from within you, basically. And when you're able to live according to that thought system and that way of being, you're able to lift yourself up from hell. And so hell is the egoic state. And heaven is living in the present moment awareness of the truth within us, the divine truth of who we are. And we can only be that truth if we let go of fear, if we completely eliminate fear, if we destroy the ego, the ego's always going to hold on to worries about the future and resentment about the past. It's always going to attack people to try to get everything to change according to what it thinks is going to make itself happy. But of course, the ego never really is happy. There's momentary enjoyment or momentary highs and lows in the ego. So you have a thrill. The ego gets a boost when something goes right, but then it soon crashes the next day when something isn't maintained or it goes wrong. So the only way to experience ongoing happiness is to destroy the ego. But back to my topic here. So I don't see any other way forward. This thing is attacking the people with the most advanced state in the egoic state. They don't have that presence within. They're not aware of consciousness. They're not aware of their divine self. These people think that their self is the thoughts in their mind. They think they can control the external world with face masks and social distancing sufficient that they're going to somehow salvage everything and it's going to go back to how it was. But it can't go back to how it was, because even if that were to work, which it won't, this thing is not going away. We're not going to live without this virus somewhere in the world, probably pretty severely, I would imagine, for a long time, probably forever. And so you can't just duck your head and force everyone to not live their lives, to take away all personal freedom, live free or die, right? You can't just hide away from life. And this is what the ego wants as a solution, because the ego is like any being, it's actually like you're possessed by this thing. A person who has any ego is possessed by ego, and it wants to live. It wants to hold its grip on you still, right? So this is its solution right now. And the more it plays this solution out, the more we're destroying everything. We're destroying the economy. Everything is going to implode as the ego tries to hold on to it all, right? And so it's just this massive collapse of ego, and that is the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so where's Jesus Christ? You are Jesus Christ. I am Jesus Christ. Anyone who gets this message of truth within you, who understands the true nature of your identity, that you're not your thoughts, that you are the consciousness observing your thoughts, the consciousness observing everything in the world. You are love. As soon as we begin to align with that, we're okay. We're not going to catch anything. We're not going to die from an illness. And even if we die, we're not really going to die. This is also Jesus' message on the cross, right? Not to fear death. Because if you fear death, that means you have fear in you, and that means you can't have been saved. So we do live on in very real ways. What's real about a person lives on. I've talked about this in other podcasts. This, what I'm putting out to the world right now, this what you see of me, I can die tomorrow, but this lives on. So I'm alive in some way. And you can live in a way that you create, and you serve people, and you love people, and you give the best of yourself. And you treat people well. And you raise kids the right way. You treat people well. Not because of a sacrifice, not because of discipline or willpower, because you know who you are. You know the truth about your being. Okay? And when you can get there, you are invulnerable. Nothing in this world Nothing in this world can threaten you. And the reason for that is that when you are aligned with truth, truth cannot change, okay? If it can be threatened or destroyed or changed, then it's not truth. Then it's just an illusion. And we've been living for a long time with a lot of illusions. The ego is illusion. Everything it thinks and does is an illusion. And the thing about any kind of illusion, and I talked about this in my book, The Switch, just wrote it a few months ago, literally, maybe 6 months ago, how crisis is only what happens when illusion is corrected, when the truth is exposed. And now we're seeing the truth about ego being exposed. We're seeing the reality of what this thing is. We thought that it was impenetrable. We thought we had the world figured out. We knew we were destroying the world. We'll get to that, how this is good for the world also. But we knew we were doing it. We didn't know the solution. We thought, how are we going to stop the economy? How the ego imploded. That's the problem. Was ego. The problem was the way we were living. And now it's imploded. It's playing out right now, and it will continue to. There's no way back. There's no other end to this. Because the ego's values are now irrelevant in this world. There's no going back. So the story of the second coming, the rapture, was told by someone. I don't know. I'm not a biblical scholar. I don't know where this story came from or how it gained such a footing in the U.S., but I do know that it was meant to teach us something, because I take it as an exact metaphor for what we're dealing with right now. Okay? People aren't going to get this message right away, but we're going to get it eventually, because we're going to see it play out. I mean, it's the present moment, and the ego is dysfunctional. It's stopped. It cannot function. It cannot go to work. It cannot do anything useful. It's cowering in fear. The ego is in its death throes in this world right now. If you don't think that this reaction is ego, you don't know what ego is. And I write a lot about ego every day on Abscondo.com. I write it in my books and on this podcast. I know very well what ego is. Ego is anytime you want to judge someone or manipulate someone, anytime you want to shame someone or blame someone, it's guilt, it's non-forgiveness, it's any kind of negative emotion, it's acting out, it's pride that I'm so much better than you. I want to be right all the time. I want to win my arguments. Or who do you think you are? It's I'm so important, but yet nobody understands it somehow, or nobody sees it. That's the best one. I love that one. Because everyone is the same way. Everyone acts within the ego. Every person is the same. You think that you're totally original, that you're misunderstood, but in reality, every person is exactly the same. A relationship, a marriage within the ego is this ugly thing where you tried. And this is a whole new topic. I need to do a different podcast for that topic. But they're all the same. People do these marriages the same way, and that's going to change, because without ego in the world anymore, it's going to naturally change. And I can tell you that once you understand what the awakened among us have experienced, you don't go back. There's not a day where you say like, yeah, I want to go back to how things were, because it's better. That's why, because it's so much better. And we're talking about the world getting so much better. I have, an 18-month-old boy and a 10-year-old girl, and I'm excited about their future now. Before, I wasn't so sure. I didn't know what kind of world they were going to inherit. We were on a crash course. And the question really only was, how far do we go before the crash? And in fact, this is the crash now. And it's not that bad. We haven't destroyed the world that irreversibly yet. And I can tell you that when you destroy ego, the problem is solved. We don't have to figure out what to do about the environment. See, I've been living in a way that I'm not really harming the environment, not because of discipline or because of laws, because I'm happy. I don't have a need to travel the world just for kicks. I don't have a need to go shopping just for kicks. I don't have these needs that destroy the world. I enjoy some nice food. I have a small apartment. I walk around the city. I don't really drive anywhere all week. But those weren't choices I made because of trying to save the planet or because of guilt. And that's what, of course, the environmentalists are trying to teach you, is to feel guilty. It doesn't work, obviously, or else it would have already worked. And that's the thing about the whole ego collapsing, is that when do we think it was supposed to work? When was the ego supposed to start working? Because it's only been a few thousand years. And think of your own life. You always have these strategies to make yourself happy. If I just had a bigger house and a bigger car, or a better job, or the right spouse, or my kids were better behaved, there's always some reason why you're supposed to be happy in the future. That's the ego. And if you think about it, why aren't you happy yet? Why haven't you been happy yet? And I can say this because I know you're not. Now you can be happy. I mean that. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm going to have a lot of work ahead of me now, because people have to catch up. I said on day one of this lockdown, I looked at what I had to do and how I had to change how I live, and I was like, well, I don't really need to change anything. I have a business that's aligned with the new world order. I've been writing all this stuff and making all this content that's totally appropriate, finally appropriate for something that exists. What I'm trying to say is that I'm not trying to say, haha, told you so. That's the last thing. I actually hurt to think about what everybody's going through out there, because I've been through it. See, I've been through a crisis. A personal crisis. The end of my 22-year-old marriage to a wonderful, wonderful woman. It felt like the end of the world for me. All the structures in my life that I had been hanging on to were just gone. They were disappearing. And it felt like it was over. I was stuck in this tiny apartment on my own, and I didn't know, I felt terrible inside. I just suffered so much at first. And I tell the story a lot, but basically, I was doing my usual stuff and trying to be cool and trying to seduce a girl and so forth. And she said, learn to love yourself. Read this book by Don Miguel Ruiz. I talked about this in the last podcast. And so I sat there and I devoured this material. And that's what everybody has to do right now. It's not just, I'm not talking about just my stuff. Start with the Tao Te Ching, read Eckhart Tolle for sure. A Course in Miracles, if you're at all Christian, because there's some correction that Jesus came back to do before this happened, a few decades ago. And you will understand the messages in the Bible. You'll understand the truth. And the truth is very simple. Learn what the ego is. And whenever you find yourself thinking that way, doing those things, you're still not there. You're still off course. And there's been a lot of conditioning in the world through these thousands of years, through our own lifetimes, to make us think in the ways of ego. And it's going to take a little bit of time to undo all that conditioning, just like, when communism ended in the Eastern Bloc, people had to change their thinking overnight, and it didn't happen overnight. It takes a long time to begin to understand that the lessons you were taught aren't relevant anymore. They're not true anymore. And I know you don't want to hear this message right now. Your ego doesn't want to hear this message because you still hope that it's going to be okay. And it could be okay, of course, if the ego was still functional, but it's not. If America, I said yesterday, America could still be the home of the free, the land of the brave, the home of the free, right? In national anthem, it's the last line of the national anthem, sung before basketball games. The land of the free and the home of the brave. I don't see anybody who's free right now. We're all, the governments are totalitarian right now, for the most part. Maybe America's almost the one exception here. And nobody's brave. I'm not afraid of getting this thing, because I don't get sick, because I don't have an ego. And if I did get sick, that would mean that my ego has come back a little bit. And it's not, your goal is no ego. Your goal is to be completely aligned with the true identity, which is love, which is God's love, unconditional love. I write a lot about this in a book called Be Love. You can download it for free from my blog, Abscondo.com. And, there are times, even in my life, where the ego has crept up a little bit, and I started to get a little bit stressed again a little bit. And sure enough, that's when I start to get a little bit of a sore throat starting. And then what I do is I meditate. I lay down and I meditate 3 or 4 or 5 times a day, and I reverse it by, finding my center, by finding my inner peace. And that's what everybody, if you did that, you wouldn't have to stay home. You wouldn't have to sacrifice your personal freedom. But people don't know this, and they're going to learn. So yeah, we're living in the end times. And by end times, that means that means time isn't so real anymore. And that's one of the other spiritual lessons. And that's, of course, why it's being taught as a Christian spirit term, the end times. It doesn't mean that everything stops and the world blows up. It means that time doesn't matter anymore. Because time is an illusion. Time is the illusion of the ego. And when you escape the ego, you no longer perceive time as anything more than just a useful way to meet people or to know what time to do your work in the day. But in reality, it's the eternal present moment. It's always now. We're moving through this now that just kind of changes. And there's no future. It's now. So what are we doing now? Well, what we're choosing to do with this present moment is we're choosing to, all the people who are aligned with ego, to go nuts, basically with fear, with no plan of how we're supposed to get through this or when it's supposed to end. What's the end game here? The ego doesn't have an end game. The ego never makes sense. The ego, its dictum is seek but do not find. So you'll never find a real solution within the ego. That's why we haven't solved the climate crisis, right? And there's no chance that we will within the ego. And when I say ego, yeah, there's your ego, there's my ego, but the government is a huge collective ego. A corporation is a collective ego. It has the values of ego, and it implements programs, and it does things that ego does. It controls people, manipulates people, threatens people with fear all the time. And the world is being run by this confused entity called ego, which, interestingly, it's the same thing. It's whether it's a government or whether it's a person, it's the same thing. It doesn't have very many varieties at all. It does the same thing. The only question is to what extent. Okay, so there is no government in the world, I don't think, that is absent of ego, because if there were, there would be, well, that's a whole different topic. We need to talk about, we should talk about that as we go along. And I want you to stay with me here, because I'm not stopping this. I have a lot of work to do. We're going to invent a new world that isn't confused. You don't have to be confused. You just have to get rid of the ego. And you don't really have a choice anymore, because there's no way forward. Either people are going to have to learn to shed the ego and identify with their divine essence within to find consciousness. I talked about that in the last podcast, number 81, how to do that. Unless you do that, you're not going to survive in this world anymore. And that hurts me to say that. I take no pleasure in anybody dying or anybody suffering. But you're going to suffer as long as it takes, and the suffering is going to get worse and worse until this message is learned. When you don't, not everyone has to learn it. You have to learn it. And when you learn it, your life is going to be okay, and your family. And you begin teaching it. But those who refuse to learn this message, those who refuse to awaken spiritually, those who refuse to destroy and shatter the ego, are not going to make it. So you don't have a choice anymore. And that's what the rapture is. I'll leave you with a song, as usual, one of my songs. And I realize all these songs I wrote from a long time ago have a lot to do with this, as well as everything else I've been doing. This song is called The System. Enjoy.
I think there's nothing much to say about a system that's seen its day. Too much has gone too wrong to keep pretending it will not be okay. I think that we all feel the same. We're tired of these games, we know, 'cause we all feel the pain. To feel and act is not the same. We both know that the system doesn't work, that it only gets worse. So let your mind is not for me. We both know that the system doesn't work, that it only gets worse. It only just hurts. One day we'll stand in shame, some kind of filthy rain, beside the rising sea, beneath the sun's tree. So let your mind go free. To fight this system is a waste, so let's take it to cyberspace. We live within and outside these institutions, but in our own place.